How does a 26-year-old soldier die on his very first mission? A mission the men themselves called Operation Certain Death, while the British public learns about it from a Sunday morning chat show. On the 10th of September 2000, while helicopters were still circling a jungle camp in West Africa, and men were still shooting at each other through the trees, General Sir Charles Guthrie sat across from television host David Frost and casually told the nation that British soldiers had just rescued their own. 7 hostages, over 100 enemy fighters, 5 minutes from execution, and a Ministry of Defense that would spend the next 48 hours lying about who had actually done it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of Operation Barras? Because if you have not, that is exactly what the people in Whitehall were counting on. Stay until the end, because what really happened in that jungle will make you question everything you think you know about how Britain fights its wars and the men it sends to fight them. To understand why 11 professional soldiers could be taken hostage in broad daylight by a gang of drug-addicted former army deserters, and why rescuing them required one of the most dangerous special forces operations in British military history, you must first understand what Sierra Leone had become by the summer of 2000. Not just a country at war, something more precise and more terrible than that. A country where war had so comprehensively dismantled every institution, every border, every agreement, that armed men with no allegiance to anything except their own survival could carve out kingdoms in the jungle and hold them for years without consequence. The Civil War had been burning since the 23rd of March, 1991, when a rebel organization calling itself the Revolutionary United Front crossed from Liberia into Sierra Leone's eastern provinces and began an insurgency against a government already rotting from the inside out. The RUF was led by a former army corporal named Foday Sankoh, and it came with a slogan that sounded almost reasonable: "No more slaves, no more masters, power and wealth to the people." It also came with a program of atrocity so systematic and so grotesque that it would generate its own international vocabulary of horror. The RUF discovered early that the most effective way to control a population was not to defeat it militarily, but to terrorize it into paralysis. Their method was amputation. Machetes and axes applied to the hands, arms, and legs of men, women, and children who had no connection to the war except that they lived in areas the RUF wanted to control. The election slogan that year had been, "The power is in your hands." The RUF's answer was to remove the hands. Tens of thousands of Sierra Leoneans were mutilated in this fashion over the course of a decade. What kept the war burning was not ideology. It was diamonds. Sierra Leone sits on some of the richest alluvial diamond deposits on the planet, and by the mid-1990s, the RUF had seized enough of the eastern diamond fields to fund a private arms network connecting to weapons dealers across 3 continents. Conflict Diamonds purchased assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and the cocaine and heroin that RUF officers reportedly rubbed into open wounds cut into their child soldiers' chests, a pharmacological method of manufacturing fearlessness in children who had been abducted from villages, forced at gunpoint to kill their own parents as proof of loyalty, and inducted into an army from which there was no honorable exit. An estimated 11,000 children participated in the Sierra Leone Civil War as combatants. Most of them had no choice. The international community tried to end it with a peace process. In July 1999, the Lomé Peace Accord was signed in the capital of Togo. The terms were breathtaking in their desperation. Foday Sankoh, the man whose organization had amputated the limbs of more civilians than any armed group in modern African history, was appointed vice president of Sierra Leone and granted control of the country's diamond mines. In exchange, the fighting was supposed to stop. A United Nations peacekeeping mission called UNAMSIL was deployed to oversee disarmament. The accord was immediately described by the people who had lived through the war as a catastrophe dressed in diplomatic language. They were right. By May of 2000, the RUF had resumed its advance on Freetown, had begun taking UNAMSIL peacekeepers hostage by the hundreds, and had demonstrated that the Lomé Agreement was not a peace. It was a pause. Into this landscape of disintegrating agreements and armed men with nothing to lose, the British Army sent a training team. The decision to deploy British forces to Sierra Leone in May of 2000 was made for one limited purpose: evacuate foreign nationals before Freetown fell. Operation Palliser sent paratroopers to secure Lungi Airport, while other elements established a perimeter around the capital. Within 48 hours, British presence had stabilized the situation enough that the anticipated fall of Freetown did not materialize. Having secured the city and extracted those who wished to leave, the initial force withdrew and was replaced by a smaller, quieter contingent with an entirely different mission. The short-term training team existed to rebuild the Sierra Leone army from the inside out. These were not combat soldiers sent to fight a war. They were instructors sent to train one side of a conflict to fight it better. In July of 2000, that team was taken over by the 1st Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment. The Royal Irish were the kind of soldiers the British Army produces in quantity, and the world notices only in emergencies. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Simon Fordham, had assembled a team that included signals specialists, medical personnel, and officers experienced in working alongside armies whose institutional integrity had been largely destroyed by a decade of civil conflict. Among the liaison officers attached to their patrols was a Sierra Leone Army officer named Lieutenant Musa Bangura, a professional soldier in a country where that description alone set a man apart, a bridge between the British instructors and the local forces they were trying to rebuild, a man whose loyalty to the legitimate government of his country had placed him in a position that certain people in the jungle regarded not as professionalism, but as betrayal. That distinction would matter enormously in the weeks ahead. What the Royal Irish could not have known was that the hostage-taking coming their way was not improvised. It was planned. According to accounts drawn from survivor interviews published after the operation, the West Side Boys were moving under a documented two-phase strategic objective they had named, with the grandiosity of men who had granted themselves military ranks they had not earned, Operation Kill British. Phase 1 was to capture British soldiers, use them as leverage to force the British military out of Sierra Leone, and eliminate the one external force capable of sustaining the Kaba government. Phase 2, designated Operation Kill All Your Family, was to seize power in Freetown in the vacuum that followed. The 11 men of the Royal Irish Patrol who turned off the main road on the 25th of August were not simply unlucky. They were the opening move in someone else's strategic plan. The West Side Boys were not the RUF. They had begun on the other side, fighting for the government against the rebel forces, and their origin was that variety of post-Civil War tragedy that produces some of history's most dangerous armed groups. Former soldiers who had done terrible things in the name of a government that subsequently refused to integrate them into the new army it was building. Stripped of legitimacy and armed with weapons that no demobilization process had collected, they retreated to the abandoned villages of Magbeni and Beribana on opposite banks of Rokel Creek in the Port Loko district, and declared themselves a force unto themselves. Their leader was a 24-year-old former sergeant named Fode Calais, who had granted himself the rank of brigadier and whose authority rested on personal violence, supernatural belief that voodoo charms made them bulletproof, and the cohesive force of narcotics shared among men with nowhere else to go. The group numbered between 400 and 600 fighters, armed with assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, 81mm mortars, and anti-aircraft guns purchased with conflict diamonds and taken from hijacked United Nations food convoys. Among their fighters were children who had been forced to kill their own parents before induction because there was no family left to go back to. On the 25th of August, 2000, Major Alan Marshall led a patrol of 11 Royal Irish soldiers and Lieutenant Bangura out of the Waterloo base for what should have been a routine visit to Jordanian UNAMSIL peacekeepers at Masiaka. They drove in 3 Land Rovers fitted with weapons mount installation kit configurations, one of them carrying a .50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun. Over the midday meal at the Jordanian base, Marshall received information that changed his plans. The West Side boys were reportedly beginning to disarm. It was the kind of tip a responsible commander in his position was obligated to investigate. The detour toward Magbeni was not recklessness. It was professional initiative in service of the mission he had been sent to Sierra Leone to accomplish. The West Side boys had an anti-aircraft gun mounted on a Bedford truck, blocking the track before the patrol reached the village perimeter. Marshall dismounted his vehicle. When a rebel attempted to seize his rifle, he resisted. He was beaten to the ground. The rest of his patrol, surrounded by armed men pointing automatic weapons from multiple directions, had no viable choice. The soldiers were forced to the bank of Rokal Creek, put into canoes, and paddled across to Berry Bana on the north bank. The 3 Land Rovers remained at Magbeni. 13 men crossed that creek. 11 Royal Irish soldiers, and 1 Sierra Leone Army officer who had done nothing except be there, doing his job, on the wrong afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Fordham began face-to-face negotiations 2 days after the capture. The meetings took place at the end of the dirt track leading to Magbeni, the closest point the rebels would allow negotiators to approach, and they were conducted under conditions that would have tested anyone trained in hostage negotiation. Fordham was assisted by a team that included hostage negotiators from the Metropolitan Police, professionals who understood the psychology of armed men making demands they had not fully thought through. That psychology, in this case, was further complicated by the chemical realities of Calais' decision-making. The West Side boys consumed palm wine, marijuana, and heroin in quantities that were not recreational. Cannabis produced short-term memory loss that caused Calais' representatives to arrive at successive meetings having forgotten what had been agreed the previous day, so demands that appeared resolved would resurface unchanged, as if the earlier conversation had never happened. Cocaine generated paranoia so intense that any British concession was immediately reinterpreted as evidence of a trap. Fordham was not negotiating with a rational actor pursuing calculable objectives. He was negotiating with a pharmacological system that rewrote its own parameters every 24 hours, and he did it with the patience and consistency of a man who understood that the alternative to talking was something he was not yet ready to authorize. While Fordham talked, the hostages endured. The 17 days in that camp were not 17 days of uncomfortable captivity. They were 17 days of sustained psychological assault conducted by armed men with no particular reason to keep their prisoners alive, and several reasons to remind them of that fact daily. Among the 6 soldiers who remained captive after the partial release were 2 who were 17 years old. Calais conducted mock executions. He would assemble the British soldiers, produce a pistol, announce that they had failed to satisfy him with their explanations for entering his territory, and hold the weapon to a man's head. Then either pull the trigger or not, according to whatever governed his behavior at that moment. At some point during the captivity, the West Side boys paraded the heads of children on poles in front of the British prisoners. This detail, drawn from survivor accounts published after the operation,
does not appear in official British government statements about the hostage crisis. It appears in the testimonies of men who were there and saw it. It is recorded here because it is part of the full reality of what Fordham was trying to resolve with diplomacy and what the soldiers in Barras understood their situation to be. On the 29th of August, Fordham demanded proof that the captive soldiers were still alive. Calais produced two of the officers, Major Marshall and Captain John Laverty, the regimental signals officer, and brought them to the meeting point.
What happened next was an act of nerve that deserves to be remembered precisely. While greeting Fordham, Captain Laverty shook hands with his commanding officer. The handshake lasted slightly longer than was natural. When Fordham withdrew his hand, he was holding a piece of paper. A sketch map of Barras, drawn from memory by Laverty during his captivity, showing the layout of every significant building in the village, the location of the room where the soldiers were being held, the positions of the guards, and the orientation of the camp relative to the river. Laverty had produced this map with armed men watching him from 2 meters away and passed it through a handshake in a setting where any sign of covert communication could have resulted in his immediate execution. The sketch drawn by a signals officer in a jungle clearing may have been the single most important piece of intelligence used to plan the rescue. It almost certainly saved the lives of the men it described. 2 days later, on the 31st of August, 5 of the 11 hostages were released: the sergeant major, 2 corporals, and 2 rangers. The 5 men were flown to RFA Sir Percival off the coast for debriefing. The 6 who remained, along with Lieutenant Bangura, were the ones Calais had decided were worth the most to him. The exchange included medical supplies. It also included a satellite telephone. This concession, framed as a humanitarian gesture to facilitate continued talks, was something rather different. The moment Calais' spokesman, a man who called himself Colonel Cambodia, an admirer of the genocidal Khmer Rouge, whose group name had been sanitized for broadcast consumption, used the phone to call the BBC in London for an interview detailing the West Side Boys' demands. Specialists from the Royal Corps of Signals were listening. They triangulated the exact position of the transmitter within minutes of the first transmission. Colonel Cambodia depleted the battery, making his broadcast, convinced he had used it to amplify his cause. He had used it to paint a target on his camp. From that point forward, British military intelligence knew precisely where Fode Calais was at any moment he chose to make a call. The rebels' greatest prize was their greatest vulnerability. 2 members of the SAS had quietly joined Fordham's negotiating team around the time of the partial release. One of them attended multiple sessions alongside Fordham, introduced to the West Side Boys as a major of the Royal Irish Regiment. He was nothing of the kind. He was a member of D Squadron, 22 Special Air Service, conducting reconnaissance under a uniform and a rank that were not his own, sitting across the table from Fode Calais and memorizing the approach routes to the village, the disposition of the guards, the fields of fire from the defensive positions, and everything else that might prove useful if the negotiation eventually failed. The intelligence he gathered, combined with Laverty's sketch and the signals intercepts from the satellite phone, was building into something that looked less like a diplomatic resolution and more like a targeting package. In London, the Cabinet Office briefing room, known publicly as Cobra, was meeting with the quiet clarity of a committee that understands its options include ones that cannot be discussed on television. The political authority to authorize an emergency assault was delegated forward to British High Commissioner Alan Jones in Freetown. The military decision was placed in the hands of Brigadier David Richards, commander of British forces in Sierra Leone. On the 31st of August, the headquarters of the 1st Battalion, Parachute Regiment, received orders. The battalion was told to assemble an enhanced company group and move to South Cerney in Gloucestershire under the cover story of a readiness exercise. All mobile telephones were confiscated before the briefing began. Only then, in a room with no phones and no way to communicate anything to the outside world, was A Company told what they were actually being asked to do. Major Matthew Lowe commanded A Company. Some of his soldiers had completed basic training 2 weeks earlier. Lowe made the decision not to replace them with more experienced personnel. Disrupting unit cohesion at the moment of deployment would create more problems than it solved. He would take the men he had and make them ready. Making them ready required understanding the geography of the problem. The West Side Boys held 2 bases simultaneously. Gabaribana on the north bank of Rokal Creek, where the British hostages were held, and Magbeni on the south bank, where the main rebel force was concentrated. The creek separated the 2 locations by approximately 400 meters of open water. Any assault on Gabaribana that failed to simultaneously neutralize Magbeni would allow the South Bank force to cross and reinforce the hostage location within minutes. 2 assaults, 2 separate targets, opposite banks of a river, coordinated to within seconds. The media, fixating on the visible preparations as the Paras moved to West Africa and appeared in Freetown, produced a coverage environment that inadvertently solved one of the most difficult problems in Special Forces deployment. D Squadron, 22 SAS, its signals attachment, and headquarters staff slipped into Sierra Leone entirely unnoticed, while every camera in Freetown was pointed at men in red berets. The regiment that was actually going to conduct the rescue walked off a military transport in the middle of a press frenzy and disappeared into operational preparation without a single photograph. On the 5th of September, the observation teams went in. This is the element of Operation Barras that receives the least attention in popular accounts of the mission, and it is the element that made everything else possible. Boat troop operators from D Squadron, working alongside personnel from the Special Boat Service, loaded themselves into inflatable raiding craft at night, navigated the sandbanks and currents of Rokal Creek in darkness, and inserted 2 teams, 1 on each bank, into concealed positions within earshot of both camp. They carried parabolic microphones capable of capturing conversations from distances at which the speakers were invisible to the naked eye. They also carried everything required to survive 4 days without resupply, without movement during daylight, and without making a sound. Hard routine is the term the British military uses for the discipline of remaining functionally motionless for extended periods in a concealed position near enemy-controlled territory. It produces soldiers who can regulate their breathing, suppress every physical reflex that might generate noise, and watch an armed man walk to within meters of their position and remain perfectly still as he passes. For 4 days, the teams lay in them of both camps and listened. They tracked guard change schedules. They identified the positions of the anti-aircraft guns and heavy weapon emplacements that would threaten any aerial insertion. They mapped viable helicopter landing zones. Through their parabolic microphones, they heard conversations inside the camps, arguments, orders, the particular texture of a community whose attention was directed elsewhere, and transmitted results back to headquarters. After 4 days, British intelligence knew more about the satellite photography could have provided. They knew it from men lying in the mud 30 meters from the enemy's perimeter, listening. At the Hastings military base 30 kilometers south of Freetown, the Paras trained on a scale replica of Magbeni, constructed from observation team intelligence, satellite imagery, and Laverty's sketch. Every building had a designated assault team. Every approach route was rehearsed until the men could move through it in darkness without reference to a map. Commanders decided the Paras would carry only weapons, ammunition, water, and field dressings into the assault. Body armor remained. Everything else that could be left behind was left behind. One fact sat over all of this preparation like a quiet weight. The Special Air Service was formed in Africa in 1941. In the 59 years between that founding and the autumn of 2000, the regiment had operated on 4 continents, rescued civilians,
ended sieges, and fought in every significant British military engagement of the second half of the 20th century. It had never once been deployed to rescue other members of the British Army. Operation Barras would be the first time. On the 9th of September, Colonel Cambodia announced that the remaining 6 Royal Irish soldiers would not be released until a new government had been formed in Sierra Leone. The negotiators concluded that this demand bore no relationship to anything deliverable. It was a stalling tactic from a man who had run out of credible demands and was substituting impossible ones to avoid the moment the conversation simply stopped. At the same time, the observation teams reported they had seen no sign of the British captives for 4 days. The hostages could not be visually confirmed as alive. There were concerns that Calais might move them further inland, into terrain from which extraction would be significantly more difficult, or from which they might disappear permanently. Cobra ordered the assault. That evening, the machinery of authorization moved with the efficiency of a process prepared for weeks.
President Ahmad Tejan Kaba gave his approval. Prime Minister Tony Blair gave his. The Army Legal Corps secured confirmation from the Sierra Leone police. Fordham placed one last telephone call to Calais, not to negotiate, but to establish through the call itself that the hostages were still alive. Calais answered. The hostages were there. Final orders went out, and somewhere in Berry Bana, through a channel that has never been officially described, a coded message reached the captive soldiers through the same satellite phone the rebels believed they controlled. When the helicopters come, get down and stay down. The night of the 9th of September was the last ordinary night in the West Side Boys' camps. Guards stood their watches. The creek moved in the dark between the 2 villages. On both riverbanks, motionless men who had been in position for 4 days waited for the morning. At 6:15 at Freetown Airport, 3 Chinook HC-2 helicopters and 2 Lynx attack helicopters from 657 Squadron Army Air Corps, armed with wire-guided anti-tank missiles and miniguns, warmed their engines on the flight line. At 6:16 on the morning of the 10th of September, 2,000 they lifted off. The flight to Roquel Creek took 24 minutes. The Lynx helicopters ran ahead, coming in low over the jungle canopy toward both camps simultaneously, targeting heavy weapon positions and striking along the riverbanks to prevent any crossing from Magbeni to Berry Bana once the ground assault began. The Chinooks followed immediately. Surprise was not achievable. The sound of 6 military helicopters approaching at low altitude in pre-dawn stillness was audible for kilometers in every direction. What could be engineered was something more precise than surprise. The compression of the enemy's reaction time to a window too short to matter. Many of the West Side Boys were asleep when the Lynx made their first pass. The remainder were nursing hangovers sufficient to significantly degrade their response time. The Chinooks came in directly behind the gunships, and the downwash from their rotors tore the tin roofs from the flimsy structures that made up the camps, adding physical chaos to the auditory assault of the attack helicopters' weapons. From the jungle edge on both banks, the SAS observation teams emerged from their 4-day concealment and opened fire, placing the West Side Boys under assault from inside their perimeter and from positions they could not see and had not known existed. The camps had been under surveillance for 4 days. They had been under fire for less than 60 seconds. 2 Chinooks hovered over Berry Bana. The SAS and SBS assault teams fast-roped from the helicopters into the village and into an adjacent open area the observation intelligence had identified as viable landing ground. They hit the ground under fire. Enough of the West Side Boys had been awake and armed to respond immediately, and the firefight that developed in those first seconds was close, loud,
and conducted at ranges where training becomes the only thing that keeps a man moving in the right direction. In the opening seconds of that firefight, Bombardier Bradley Tinnion was hit. The round entered his flank. His comrades pulled him back to the helicopter. He was evacuated to RFA Sir Percival off the coast, where a medical team was waiting. The resuscitation attempts were intensive and sustained. They were not sufficient. Bradley Tinnion, 26 years old, formerly of 29 Commando Regiment Royal Artillery, transferred to 22 Special Air Service 2 years earlier, died on his first operational deployment as a fully badged member of the regiment. His partner, Anna Homsey, was carrying their daughter Georgia at the time.
Georgia was born after her father was gone, into a world where he was already a name in a government gazette rather than a man who came home in the evenings. Across the creek, the third Chinook reached Magbeni. The briefing had told the paras that the ground at their landing zone was wet. What they discovered when they jumped from the tail ramp was that it was not wet. It was a swamp. They plunged into black water up to their chests, rifles held above their heads, equipment immediately saturated, the weight of body armor and ammunition driving them down toward mud, while the Chinook's downwash churned the surface around them. They waited for the tree line with the urgency of soldiers who understand that the water they are fighting through is the safest place they will be for the next several hours. The West Side boys in Magbeni were awake and fighting. Moving toward the village following the plan rehearsed in the Hastings replica, each platoon assigned to specific clusters of buildings with the layout committed to memory, the paras were perhaps 100 meters from the perimeter when a mortar shell detonated among them. Major Matthew Lowe went down. Several key personnel around him were wounded in the same blast. The company commander of A Company was out of the fight in the opening minute of his first combat command. The paras did not stop. The sergeants and color sergeants, whose job is precisely to function in the absence of officers, took control of their sections and continued the assault. Not every account of military professionalism is about special forces or elite units or years of specialized training. Some of it is about ordinary soldiers who were given a job and a plan, and the discipline to execute both, regardless of what the first minute took from them. The paras went through Magbeni building by building, following a plan rehearsed until it was automatic, until the plan and the training overrode the chaos of what was happening around them. In Gabaribana, D Squadron was clearing the village under sustained fire. The observation teams continued to engage from the jungle edge, maintaining pressure that prevented any organized counterattack from forming. The Lynx helicopters circled the riverbanks, targeting movement toward the crossing points. The noise was the noise of a small war conducted in an area the size of several city blocks. Automatic weapons, rotor wash, grenade detonations, and the sharp crack of high-velocity rounds passing close to men trying to avoid them. Then, through all of it, came a sound. British voices, shouting. 2 words repeated. British Army, British Army. The hostages had heard the helicopters. They had received the coded message. They were alive. They were in their building, and they were announcing their location to the men moving through the village toward them. The SAS located them by their voices. All 6 Royal Irish soldiers were found in the building shown on Laverty's sketch. They had been in that camp for 16 days and 17 nights. They were physically and mentally exhausted, in the considered assessment of Lieutenant Colonel Fordham, who visited them shortly after the operation. They were alive. Lieutenant Musa Bangura was not with them. The SAS searched the village and found Bangura in an open pit at the camp's edge, a pit the West Side boys had used as a latrine. He had been kept apart from the British soldiers throughout his captivity, held in conditions that reflected how Calais assessed the offense of a Sierra Leonean officer serving alongside the British Army. He had been beaten, he had been starved,
He was too weak to stand. The soldiers who found him carried him to the helicopter. His extraction had been designated in the operational planning as equal in priority to the extraction of the British soldiers.
That designation, embedded in a targeting document before a shot was fired, is one of the details of Operation Barras that official accounts have historically passed over quickly. It deserves more than that. The operation also freed 22 Sierra Leonean civilians held in the camp. Men subjected to forced labor and crude military training. Women held as sex slaves. People with no connection to the Royal Irish Patrol and no protection from what had been done to them, except the eventual fact that someone with a gun had a reason to care. A 23rd civilian died during the assault. His name was Brema Foba. He was a teacher. He was attempting to flee when he was caught in the firefight. His name appears in almost no popular account of Operation Barras. It is part of what happened. Fode Calais was captured alive in the clearance of Gberry-Bana. In the weeks that followed, he broadcast a surrender appeal on Sierra Leonean radio, urging the remaining West Side boys to turn themselves in to UNAMSIL peacekeepers. Some of those who surrendered would eventually be accepted into the reformed Sierra Leone Army, the very institution they had refused to join before the raid that ended their war. At Magbeni, the Paras fought through the village until it was secure. They recovered all 3 Royal Irish Land Rovers, including the one carrying the .50 caliber Browning machine gun. Mopping up operations continued until 1400 hours that afternoon. The main action, the extraction of the hostages, had been completed before 7 o'clock in the morning. Less than 20 minutes after the first SAS trooper hit the ground in Gberry-Bana, every living person who needed to be out of that village was out of it. General Sir Charles Guthrie appeared on Breakfast with Frost that Sunday morning, while the mopping up was still ongoing. The British public learned that their soldiers had been rescued from a hostage crisis in West Africa from a political chat program, delivered in the measured tones of a man who seemed to find it appropriate to make this announcement in a television studio. The Ministry of Defense issued a press release later that day. It made no mention of the Special Air Service. The SAS troopers who had fast-roped into Gberry-Bana and cleared it under fire were presented, by implication, as paratroopers. The cover story unraveled within hours. Military observers noted a single word in the casualty notification: Bombardier, an artillery designation, a rank that exists in the Royal Artillery and its affiliated units, and nowhere in the Parachute Regiment. A paratrooper cannot hold the rank of Bombardier. The structure of the British Army's own rank system had made concealment impossible. The MOD's attempt to protect the anonymity of its special forces collapsed on the technicality that the rank of the one man who died told every informed observer exactly which regiment he had served in. What remained after the cover story failed was the image of an institution that had tried, in the hours after one of its soldiers died on his first mission, to be less than honest about the nature of his service. Tinnion received a posthumous mention in dispatches. The London Gazette recorded him, correctly and finally, as Bombardier Bradley Tinnion, 22 Special Air Service Regiment. The confirmed enemy dead numbered 25 West Side boys. The actual toll was almost certainly higher. The Lynx had conducted extensive strafing runs along the jungle tree lines flanking both villages, and the bodies of those killed in those strikes were not recovered for counting. The figure most commonly cited by those with access to the full picture is somewhere closer to 80. Over 300 West Side boys surrendered to Jordanian UNAMSIL peacekeepers within 2 weeks of the assault. The organization that had planned to use British hostages as the opening move in a campaign to drive the British out of West Africa ceased to exist as a military force in less than a fortnight. The broader consequences moved more slowly, but in the same direction.
British political support for UNAMSIL increased significantly in the months that followed. New commitments were made at the United Nations Security Council. The Kaaba government consolidated its position through the remainder of 2000 and into 2001. On the 18th of January 2002, 16 months after D Squadron fast-roped into Gaberi Bana, President Kaaba declared the Sierra Leone Civil War officially over. A war that had killed 200,000 people and mutilated tens of thousands more had ended. The British intervention was not the only factor in that ending. It was among the decisive ones. In December of 2004, the British Ministry of Defence announced that a new unit would be formally established to fill a role first improvised at Rokel Creek. A permanent battalion-sized formation built around the core of the 1st Battalion, Parachute Regiment, with additional elements from the Royal Marines and the RAF Regiment, whose purpose was to provide direct infantry support to United Kingdom Special Forces on operations too large or too complex for Special Forces alone to execute. The Special Forces Support Group was formally established on the 3rd of April, 2006. The relationship between the Paras and the SAS improvised under pressure at Rokel Creek, Special Forces conducting the primary objective, while a conventional infantry force neutralized the adjacent threat, had been examined by the people responsible for structuring the British military and judged effective enough to be made permanent.
The template tested at Berry Bana and Magbeni became the architectural blueprint for how Britain conducts complex Special Forces operations. The SFSG deployed in Iraq as part of Task Force Black, the joint formation that hunted senior al-Qaeda figures in the years after the invasion. It deployed in Afghanistan. It stands on counter-terrorism readiness for domestic incidents. Every time British operators conduct a raid that requires both a primary assault force and a simultaneous blocking element, they are executing a doctrine whose proof of concept was A Company jumping into a West African swamp and fighting through a jungle village after their commander went down in the opening minute. Brigadier David Richards, who held military command authority for Operation Barras on the morning of the 10th of September 2000, went on to serve as Chief of the Defence Staff, the professional head of the entire British Armed Forces. The unit his experience helped create now serves as a permanent component of UK Special Forces. It was not built from a policy paper or a strategic review. It was built from a lesson learned in a particular place, by men who jumped into a chest-deep swamp and kept moving. Bradley Tinnion went to Sierra Leone on his first deployment as a fully badged SAS trooper and did not come back. The Ministry of Defence described him as a paratrooper. His rank gave him away within hours. He was a former artilleryman who had passed the hardest selection course in the British military, earned the right to wear the sand-coloured beret, and was killed in the opening seconds of the first mission he was ever sent on. His daughter Georgia was born after he was gone, carrying his name into a world he never got to see. Operation Barras is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a footnote to a civil war most people in the Western world have already forgotten. But the 7 men who came home from Gaberi Bana in the first hour of that Sunday morning carried more than their lives with them. They carried proof that a small force of disciplined soldiers, operating with precise intelligence and absolute nerve, can accomplish what entire armies, equipped with overwhelming firepower, cannot always guarantee. They can go into a place where the odds say they should not survive and come out with everyone they went in to find. The West Side Boys had nearly 600 fighters across 2 defended positions. D Squadron and A Company together numbered 272. The math looked impossible. The math was wrong. Today, the Special Forces Support Group stands as a permanent component of UK Special Forces, built from the doctrine first proven on the banks of Rokel Creek. Every time British operators fast rope into a hostile compound in a country most people cannot find on a map,
They are executing something written in swamp water and early morning gunfire on the 10th of September, 2000. The men who were there called it Operation Certain Death. They survived it anyway. That gap between the name they gave it and the outcome they achieved is the whole story of what the British soldier is capable of when everything goes wrong and the world is not watching. Now you know it, and now you know why it matters.